The involvement of Red Cross in the recent Ebola crisis is a natural extension of the actions of the founder Henry Drouin. In 1859, when Drouin witnessed the suffering of 20,000 casualties of war, he felt compelled to act, and he set about organizing the locals to help them. Thus the Red Cross was born, what followed were the Geneva Conventions and the first Nobel Peace Prize, which went to Drouin. The actions of Drouin can be seen as a personal response to a moment on a battlefield. His actions can be seen more broadly as the courage to be kind. There are many times other than war when this courage is needed. Thus it was as stories came out of West Africa about an Ebola outbreak that had overwhelmed the local health industry and was threatening to become a widespread disaster, perhaps even a worldwide disaster. The world seemed to stand back, paralyzed in fear, and countries set about putting up walls to protect their borders rather than fighting the outbreak at its source. It was like neighbors, each filling their own fire buckets and waiting to defend their own homes rather than teaming up to fight the fire at its source. At a practical level, this response was going to allow the further spread of Ebola and increase the risk of it reaching countries such as Australia. At a humanitarian level, this was like standing back passively watching a playground bully at work. We need to ask why so many countries seem to be paralyzed at the moment action was needed. We need to ask how we can do better next time. Fear is very powerful at both the individual and the national level. At the individual level, many health workers no doubt wanted to go and help, but feared that they would contract Ebola. Perhaps a greater fear among workers was the fear that they would not be able to cope psychologically with what they would experience. They feared that they would be entering an unimaginable nightmare. I came to see that fear not only could prevent useful situations, it could paralyze the ability to think clearly. Fear is also useful to some. By promising to protect us from the things we fear, some leaders sought to gain popularity. They exaggerated risk and promoted isolation of West Africa and of returning health workers as a simplistic solution. Some actively discouraged health workers from going to West Africa. I believe after such a crisis as this Ebola outbreak, we need to reflect on how we handle the situation and to prepare to perform better in the next such crises. An example of this sort of reflection is the United States Presidential Ethics Commission report, which recognized it is in the interest of both the US and the world to become positively involved in such crises. Courage is the antidote to fear. Courage is not just about protecting our self-interest, it is about kindness to others. I believe through courage and kindness to others, we can transcend fear and respond much more effectively to crises such as the recent Ebola outbreak. Ban Ki-moon summed it up: the best antidote to fear is an effective and urgent response. This Ebola outbreak was much larger than all 20 previous outbreaks together. It was occurring in an area where the health workforce was depleted by recent war, and now Ebola was killing many of the local health workers, which made the situation even less manageable. MSF, which had been involved in Africa's previous outbreaks, found the task was beyond its resources. Some countries and organizations stepped forward, and my old employer, Red Cross, was one of these. Red Cross provided a boost to the depleted health workforce. They sent in battle-hardened teams that could build special field hospitals and the leadership to organize the work. Most importantly, their presence helped the locals to have courage. Their presence said to the locals they had not been abandoned. Courage, like Ebola, is highly contagious and established itself in our hospitals, contact tracers, and burial teams. Red Cross did not just send in people without preparation. Courage does not equate to recklessness. The people going in were psychologically screened, then they were trained in the use of PPE. PPE, the space suit of the Ebola worker, made treating Ebola patients vastly safer. 500,000 PPE suits were required, and Estonia donated these. The Norwegian Air Force delivered them to West Africa. This was an operation that built a community of the courageous. So when I decided to become part of the solution rather than a spectator, it was as a minor pawn in a huge operation. So why don't I take you through some of my personal experiences going to West Africa to illustrate the battleground where fear and courage fought it out. For me, the experience in Sierra Leone was both a very positive one, working with aid workers from within Sierra Leone and those who had gathered from around the globe. At the same time, it was clearly stressful and sad. There was a positive energy of being part of a team that had taken on a massive outbreak. With predictions that millions of lives could be lost, we had a sense of being part of a major medical front line. There was the positive energy in the individual stories of why people had assembled in an African town to do a difficult task for others. This was inspiring and made one proud to be human. These nurses and other team members coming together in Africa made you realize that we cared for these people far from our homeland in their time of great need. Each time we admitted an Ebola patient, we reduced the chance of transmission to others. Each safe and dignified burial likewise reduced the spread of the disease. Each admission hopefully improved the chances of survival of the admitted patient. These were all positives. Each admission meant someone may die alone rather than surrounded by their family. That is the hard part. In the first few months of this outbreak, the death rate was 80%. Thus, many of those admitted died, and many of these died alone. Out of fear, many of our patients presented late and were very ill on admission, which gave them little chance of survival. So we often found ourselves caring for people we had almost no time to get to know before they died an awful, painful, and lonely death. The first time I dressed in the elaborate protective outfit that we wore, I entered the ward just as a 2-week infant began to fit, and he bled to death in my arms. While I found this confronting, I then came to realize his mother had lost all 7 of her children and her husband to Ebola in this treatment center. It had taken our whole family. She felt she had no reason to live. I realized right then I had no right to self-pity. This was my introduction to Ebola, a disease that takes whoever it pleases, baby, child, brother, sister, mother, and father. Death was stalking West Africa in the same way it had during the plagues of Europe, and it had brought the country to a halt through fear. Schools were closed, health resources were diverted from other diseases such as malaria and also maternal health. Many businesses went under. Over the weeks I was there, I saw many children, young adults, women and men die. Sometimes they would fight so hard to survive and overcome the virus, but the virus would overcome them. Others would be doing well, eating, drinking, talking, and you would think that all is okay and they are going to make it. But the virus would move in swiftly and silently and take them suddenly and alone. That was always something I found hard, that people died alone, some very frightened. I sat with one 16-year-old who arrived from Freetown the day before. His family came. His father was a local doctor who had died treating Ebola patients. Unfortunately, after he contracted the disease, he passed it on to his family. His wife, his mother, 2 sons, one being this 16-year-old, who were all confirmed cases of Ebola. This young man was very sick. I had put up IV fluids with maybe some hope that he could successfully fight it. I then especially dressed in PPE to go and sit with him for another 40 minutes as he was scared. I held his hand during this time. I told him I had come from Australia and that my name was Anne. I told him to fight. He died. The next day, his brother, who was doing well, drinking, eating, talking, died. His mother and grandmother did well and survived. Yes, they survived. Yes, there are survivors. Survival was the time to raise our spirits through celebration. With each survivor, we waited for them to be symptom-free and then checked their blood to confirm that they were now disease-free. Once the person was declared disease-free, we would celebrate this day with the happy day of discharge, which included a discharge shower named the Happy Shower. They received new, uncontaminated clothes, money, food, and transport home to their families. They were given a certificate to say they were free of Ebola, which hopefully overcame community fears that they would no longer be a risk to others. One of the things they received before discharge was a handshake. This handshake symbolizing so much for them, as they have been unable to have such simple human contact for this time, and now they were free of the virus and could touch other people at last. For the many who did not survive, safe burial became paramount. When people die, it is the most contagious stage of the disease, as the virus has multiplied to large numbers by the time of death. The virus can remain alive on the corpse for up to 4 days. Families were no longer able to carry out their normal burial practices, such as cleaning and dressing their loved ones. Trained burial teams took over all the funerals of the confirmed and suspected Ebola cases. The body was sprayed with 0.5% chlorine and placed in double body bags. A photo was taken of the face for the family. Family members were invited to the burial but did not always come because of the stigma that surrounds the disease. If the family were unable to be present, members of the Red Cross performed a Christian and Muslim service. Red Cross set up a very poignant graveyard for those who died. They replaced the mass former graves with a system of individual name plots. These graveyards are very moving and memorialize those who have lost their battle with this disease. The image of Ebola in the West has been the PPE space outfit. PPE, this stands for Personal Protective Equipment, and the spacesuit appearance of this outfit is what the image of Ebola around the world became. PPE made treating Ebola patients safe. With use of PPE, the transmission of Ebola to healthcare workers dropped dramatically. Basically, Ebola is transmitted by contact with body fluids. This means if your entire body is covered, then body fluids cannot make contact with you and you cannot get Ebola. It all sounds very simple, however, it was not that simple. Taking the PPE off involves taking off contaminated layers without becoming infected by contact with any of the contaminated outer surface of the outfit. It has to be done properly. It was being done in tropical heat and humidity after 40 to 60 minutes of being cooped up in a suit that does not let your body heat out. It is always done with a companion present to make sure mistakes do not happen. PPE is uncomfortable and hot, and you can only wear it for 40 to 60 minutes, otherwise you'll get too hot and can collapse. PPE includes triple gloves, so it's hard to do procedures such as putting in drips while in PPE. The gloves also make it hard to have the usual physical contact with patients that is so much of the comforting role nurses perform. PPE has another effect. It helps you disconnect enough from the suffering around you that you can cope better with it. The world needs to learn from this outbreak. While the initial response was slow, and we can concentrate on the negative aspects of that response, there is a positive message. The world recognized that a very nasty disease was probably going to take millions of lives, and some communities did respond in a timely manner, and the response was successful. Red Cross, with its values and commitment to humanity, was a significant part of that response. Red Cross showed without the resources available in our Australian hospitals, we could build a simple hospital and supply simple rehydration and save so many lives. We could persuade people to enter our hospitals to isolate themselves so others could live. We tried to relieve suffering among the dying, and we provided some dignity to safe disposal of dangerously contaminated bodies. Red Cross showed that the combination of knowledge, humanity, and courage, and the rejection of pure self-interest could make a difference. I believe the founder of Red Cross would be proud of what the organization achieved. The US Presidential Commission summed up what the world had learned and how we should prepare better for the next outbreak. Ethics and enlightened interest converge in calling for our country to address epidemics at their source. They also pointed out, needlessly restricting the freedom of experts and caring healthcare workers is both morally wrong and counterproductive. It will do more to lose lives than to save them. This could simply be stated as the courage to be kind would have conquered the outbreak much earlier and much simpler. At an individual level, what did I come back with? What did it change in me? I did not come back with PTSD. I think that child dying in my arms made me recognize it was not about me and my needs. We were there to help, and if we could not save lives, we were there to show the kindness of health carers. As a world, we needed the courage to turn up and be kind to others. All of us going into West Africa had some fear of contracting Ebola. We all had that other fear that was probably stronger for most of us, that we would not cope with what we would see. Many of us on the ground found we were braver than we ever thought we could be. This included the courage not to wall off the suffering we saw around us, but to engage with it. This is the courage to be kind. What else did I learn? You learn to cope with the knowledge that you cannot save everyone, that at times when the admission rate rose, people would die for lack of simple resources. You learn to accept that, so that you could focus your energies in ways that would save as many as possible. You learned how to maintain hope when people were predicting a massive worldwide epidemic. You learned that being in a team of positive people kept hope alive. The courage to be useful and kind was what kept the teams on the ground from despair. This is kindness in action. I also had a lesson or two in the ability of fear to paralyze. On my return to Australia, public health officials were not focusing on educating the public that returning health professionals were not a threat to Australia. Unfortunately, these officials set out to make it appear that I was under some form of quarantine in order to allay unwarranted fears. The simple reality is that Ebola has not been passed on in the first 3 days of fever. And so if a returning aid worker were to be infected, there would be plenty of time to safely isolate them. The focus here should have been to help people understand Ebola and help contain the disease. Our role is not to respond to hysteria. Our role is to educate everyone so that we are able to maintain a public health role that is calm and rational. All those who guide public health policy, such as politicians and members of health departments, should read the United States Presidential Ethics Commission report for guidance on how to handle the next Ebola outbreak. I want to share with you an instance of how easily health professionals who were experts on contagious tropical diseases could be reduced to frightened people who could no longer perform their role. 18 days following my first return, and knowing I needed a fresh supply of anti-malarial medication, and with no evidence I had Ebola, an appointment was made for me with a practice that specializes in travel health. On the morning of the appointment, I was phoned and informed that this practice had held a special meeting and decided that I was far too great a threat to be allowed inside their doors. So I set off in a packed morning train, walked through the streets of Perth, paused to have a coffee in a cafe, and then, as instructed, made my way to the front door of the practice. I phoned the receptionist and waited for the door to open, just sufficient for an eye to look around and a disconnected hand to toss my medication onto the pavement in front of me. The door shut as I bowed gratefully and collected my package and made my way back through the crowds of Perth. This brought home to me that well-educated, knowledgeable fellow health professionals could be reduced to mere fools by lacking the courage to question fear. We are all capable of panic, but we seldom achieve anything worthwhile when we yield to fear. At national and international levels, what are the lessons? There are some organizations such as MSF and Red Cross and some countries such as Norway, Finland, and Cuba, to name just a few, that generously provided teams early in the crisis. These organizations and countries have enriched their histories with a moment they can be proud of. They have provided an ethical model for others. These are the moments that build nations and organizations. These are the moments that set the moral tone of societies. They separate the givers and the takers. These moments in a nation's history set benchmarks and values that determine how other ethical matters are tackled. This includes how we respond to bullying in the workplace and those who seek our sanctuary from war. These are the moments when nations and organizations gain the ethical right to pass judgment on others and set the moral tone for their futures. In this crisis, Red Cross responded in a similar way to its founders' actions on that battleground in 1859. I leave it to you all to reflect on how we as a nation responded to Ebola and how we respond to refugees, bullies in the workplace, and the injustices we encounter in our society. I ask you all to leave here and reflect on how we can each achieve the courage to be kind. Thank you.